A key component of the modern world economy, the chemical industry delivers products and innovations to enhance everyday life. It is also an industry in transformation, where chemical executives and workers are delivering growth and industry-changing advancements while responding to pressures from investors, regulators, and public opinion. Discover how leading companies are approaching these challenges here on The Chemical Show. Join Victoria Meyer, president of Progressio Global and host of The Chemical Show, as she speaks with executives across the industry and learns how they are leading their companies to grow, transform, and push industry boundaries on all frontiers. Here's your host, Victoria Meyer.
Hi, I'm Victoria Meyer. Welcome back to The Chemical Show. This week, I am speaking with Stephen Mothersole, who is the CEO of Chemical Search International. Stephen's a global guy who got a bachelor's in chemistry at Hull University in the UK before heading west to the glorious town of Cincinnati, Ohio, where he studied at the University of Cincinnati and had a great experience there before moving back across the pond over to the UK, working in investment banking as a chemicals equity analyst, and then ultimately joining Air Products and Chemicals in the UK, as well as Pennsylvania and Hamburg and other places. In 2000, Stephen founded Chemical Search International and grew it to become a well-respected executive search firm for chemical sectors worldwide. So we're going to be talking recruiting, executive search, and other great things today. Stephen, welcome to The Chemical Show.
Victoria, thanks a lot. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. What is your origin story? So we've covered a little bit in that bio, but what's your origin story? What got you interested in the chemical industry and ultimately executive search?
Yeah, no, thanks. So you covered a few things there. So yeah, I mean, I think at school, chemistry was something I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed test tubes and doing things in the kitchen, as you do. My parents didn't, but I did. But yeah, as you said, I went to Hull University, did a BS in chemistry. Had no idea what to do at that point, and decided to head west. I applied to a number of American universities, including University of Honolulu, who rejected me.
Nice.
Because for some reason they thought I wasn't going there to study. But go figure. There we go. But yeah, so in the end, I went to Cincinnati University, spent 2 years there, did a master's. Started a PhD, but I decided to head back home before finishing that one. There you go. So yeah, I came back to the UK with the intention of getting into a chemical company. Bizarrely, I found it very hard to get a job at that point during I think this particular part of the economic cycle. So in the end, I went into the city with a very unusual move to do. A friend of mine who worked in banking said, "You can be an equity analyst." And I remember my first interview and they said, "What do you know about stocks and shares?" And I said, "Not very much, to be frank, but I'm happy to learn." And that's really where things started. So I did that for about 3 years, then left, did an MBA in Barcelona, decided to then really try even harder and join a chemical company. So I did. And as you said, I joined Air Products and Chemicals, did a stint in Allentown, Pennsylvania, 5 years in Germany. And what got me into the executive search game is actually, well, necessity, actually. So I found myself needing a job after Air Products tried to purchase BOC, I think their nearest rival. The European Commission, of course, said, no, that's not going to happen. So in the end, I knew it was on the cards, so I interviewed with lots of different search firms. And I kind of dawned on me after a while that not many of them at the time in Europe seemed to understand the chemical industry very well. At least that's my perception. And so I thought to myself, how hard can this be? I'll set a search firm up and see whether I can either A, find myself a job, or B, I might enjoy it so much I keep doing it. And of course, the answer was B. 23 years later, we're still doing it. And I'm enjoying it immensely. What can I say?
Awesome.
So that's what I got into doing it. There we go.
Very cool. So tell us a little bit about Chemical Search International.
Yep. So we started really with just myself way back in 2000. Slowly grew over the years, and our recipe was always the same. We decided to effectively, maximize on the industry knowledge, understanding, because that was the bit that was missing. So everyone who works for us now, we're about 15 at the sharp end who do the actual search work. We're all from the industry. We've all worked for large chemical companies somewhere or other. Today we're about equally split. Some folks in the States, some of us in Europe, and some guys in Asia. And we do middle to C-suite roles effectively as a proper executive search. That's what we do. So I think we've got a few USPs, I suppose. I think one of them, of course, is the global nature of what we do. Another one, very much, we're all from the industry, so we think we know what we're talking about, which is a good thing. And I think the other thing as well, which I really maximize upon, is the sort of the consultative nature of what we do. We very much like to act as a partner. We don't just see resumes. We interview in depth. We do it in a very consultative, sort of super selective kind of way, and clients seem to like that. So that's us.
Very cool. What are the key trends that you're seeing today in executive search?
The executive search. Well, okay. There are a few. I think. I mean, there's a number of issues, a number of things going on. Yeah, within the industry. Are you referring about macro trends or things relating specifically to executive search?
Let's do executive search, and then we're gonna go deep, and then we'll come back out and let's talk about the macros first. But let's talk about. Well, okay. Actually, we're gonna flip this, Stephen.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Hang tight. What are the trends that you see going on in the industry? And you're sitting in Europe, so you've got a different point of view than I certainly have sitting in the US and a lot of my guests. What are the trends that you see going on, and how does that translate then to your business and what you do from a search perspective?
Well, there's a few, I suppose, obvious trends going on right now across the industry. I mean, there's some really obvious ones. I mean, diversity and inclusion is now a very large, very big issue, very current topical issue. And all search firms, including ourselves, are always asked to try and find a diverse slate of candidates. Easier said than done sometimes, unfortunately. The chemical industry is not unique in this perspective, but you tend to find within the industry that the further away from the cracker you get, the more diverse it gets. Yeah. So if we're doing a search in petrochemicals, shall we say it's a fairly homogeneous talent pool, despite our best efforts. And that is true. That is true kind of globally. Spec chem is a little bit in between, that you get more diverse talent there. And I think that it's best in the sort of the fine chemical end of things. Anything close to the consumer, fine chemicals, cosmetic ingredients, paints and coatings, things like that. That tends to have a better balance, I think. So that's definitely one trend, this drive for diversity and inclusion. And obviously we try very hard to do that. I mean, I'll give you, for example, on that one, we're doing a search right now for I suppose it's a bioproducts company, biopolymers company for a CEO, actually. Relatively small company over here in Europe. And amazingly, they have 43% female workforce, which is unusual, very high.
That's impressive. Yeah.
It is very high. Yes, exactly. But I think the rest of the industry has a long way to go to catch up to that. And that is caused by a number of issues. It's also caused by less younger people moving into the industry, doing degrees in the STEM sciences over a number of years. So that's been declining for a number of years. And of course, that feeds through to finding it hard to find anyone, quite frankly, let alone diverse talent. So that's definitely one trend. I think another one, I mean, obviously artificial intelligence is so much in the news. And for good or ill, I think it will have an effect on executive search and the candidates receiving the briefs and things. I mean, whether that is useful or not, who knows? I think we find it to be, I suppose, I haven't come across it yet in our search, but I think it's coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to me, anything that can make things easier and more effective, and more efficient for clients is always welcomed. But I think, artificial intelligence will affect us. But I think, ultimately, hiring people is a people-to-people interaction, isn't it? And it may make the back office more efficient, but I think ultimately there is that need for the human interaction, the ability to look at the nuance behind people, what makes people tick, etc. So I think there'll be an increased focus on a quality search firm sort of partner who can dig beneath the surface and really work out what makes people tick, etc., alongside just simply finding people faster. So that's definitely a second trend. I mean, other trends, of course, everyone wants to work from home nowadays. I'm at home as we speak,
Me too.
as I commented.
Yeah.
You too. There you go. But yeah, I think this has an effect on people's mentality too. I think on the one hand, it makes our job slightly easier because, quite frankly, finding people and talking to them when they're working at home is easier than when they're in the office.
True.
Yeah,
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I mean, the talent pool should be it should be easier because, of course, there isn't this need to relocate people. So, I think certain functions will always struggle with this. It won't help them. So, R&D and technical roles where you need to be on a plant, then yes, that won't help them. But I think sales roles and a lot of roles now, which are broader and you can work remotely, that makes it easier to find people. And now that's the plus argument. That the counter argument to that, of course, is that people value different things, don't they? So if I'm happy in my job and I'm allowed to work from home 5 days a week, and I'm trying to sell a job to somebody where they have to go in the office 2 or 3 days a week, suddenly that's unappealing. And so I think even though the talent may be easier to find, it doesn't necessarily mean they're easier to move. So I think that's definitely
interesting. And I think sometimes one of the things with that, Stephen, is it's sometimes hard to know what it really is going to feel like when you make that shift and what that looks like. So, I reflect back to when I went from Shell to Clariant. We had a 980 system, very, so every other Friday off, and it was a very global company. And yeah, you could work from home period. If you needed to, you just kind of set your schedule like that. And then I went over to Clariant, which number one, did not have 980s. So you're in the office Monday through Friday. And my business was more relaxed about whether or not you were in the office, but the business I sat with was not. And it's like, you kind of almost even realize the stress that puts on you until you're living in it. So I think this whole aspect, it's easy for us to recognize the situation that we're in and the pros and cons and what we like about it. And we think we can envision what the other scenario will be, but until you're actually in it, you don't know it.
You don't. I've got another good example of this one, I suppose. I mean, we recently did a search in Europe for an MD of a company. And one of the first candidates I called indicated to me that they lived only 30 miles away, very close. And they said, perfect, easy commute, no problem at all. A month later or 6 weeks later, when it finally came down to an offer, they finally said, you know what? I just can't do it. I'm so used to working from home. I cannot envisage going in 5 days a week to this location, even though it's only half an hour drive. Right. So I think, people have got institutionalized, and it's a trick. Yeah. It's difficult.
Tricky times.
Yeah, tricky. So, so what did I say? A few things. Yeah, diversity, IT, or
AI.
AI. Yeah. I mean, the other one I think that kind of goes along hand in hand with all this in some ways is, what companies are looking for, and I think this whole thing around soft skills has become, far more important than it was before. And I think in a workplace where you've got to get that fit right, got to get that person's fit right, yeah. And the soft skill side of things has become again increasingly more important. We see it more with more senior roles. But
what is it when you talk about soft skills?
Yeah,
what are you really referring to? I mean, because that covers a broad range.
It does. It really refers to personality, motivation, what makes people tick. Yeah. As opposed to can they do the job? I mean, and I think, the whole area of psychometrics, of course, is designed to try and address this whole issue. And yes, we use them, but I think one of the things we probably pride ourselves on is we're quite obsessive with not only interviewing the candidates, but also in some ways interviewing or looking at who they're working for. What is their personality like? Just to make sure you get that fit. Because people leave jobs for all manner of reasons, and one of the biggest reasons is they just don't get on with their boss or their peers or something like this. And I think that's now been recognized. So you've got to have a meeting of minds, and I think people have recognized this. So it's not enough now just to be able to do the job. You've got to make sure you fit, the personality fits. We spend time doing
I'm going to challenge you on this a little bit, Stephen.
Go on.
Because we started out talking about DEI and how important that is. And yet, when you're judging people on fit, it can be anti-diversity of all varieties. Um, how do you get around that? I mean, because one, DEI is often just seen as a metric and a target, and do I have
right.
representation of different races and genders and what have you? Fit's very important, but fit is also a really hard standard to meet. And a lot of people would argue that fit keeps the status quo.
That's a very good. That's a very good point, actually, Victoria. It is, and you're absolutely right. I mean, historically, people hire people who look like them. That's what they've always said, yeah, and it's true.
Similar values. You look like me. You talk like me. We have similar values, etc.
Similar body language, all this kind of thing. No, exactly. You're absolutely correct. I mean, that I think has always been an issue. I mean, I think certain companies in the creative sectors do very well, that they recognize that one size cannot fit all. But I think that's definitely a hurdle to come over or overcome. I mean, I think things like psychometrics and things which are, I suppose, quasi-scientific to try and homogenize these things, so you're seeing the same set of skills with everybody, irrespective of diversity or background. That's important. We run a particular one which is done in different languages. Of course, that can't actually level out different attitudes to certain questions. That's always the hard thing. So, for example, somebody in the Far East, do not like the people in Asia generally often do not like talking about themselves or promoting themselves. People in the US enjoy it very much, should I say? And I guess in Europe we're kind of in between, yeah. So you can never really iron out all those things. But I think if you are looking for a diverse slate, you have to almost recognize that providing certain personality traits are there. You have to almost ignore the rest and recognize the fact that not everyone's going to be equal. Yeah. So, but I obviously take your point. I think people have always hidden their own image, and I think that's a very hard thing to kind of break down. But I think having some kind of almost semi-independent method of judging people and measuring them against each other, which is irrespective of where they're from or what background they have, has got to be useful. We don't always use them. Often people have done psychometrics and things like this, and some of them are pretty much across the board. Things like Myers-Briggs and things most people worldwide have done. And there is some kind of similarity there. But I think some of the more elaborate techniques are quite useful in helping to select people.
I could totally see that. And it absolutely needs to be a data point that gets factored in along with everything else that goes into the equation.
Indeed.
Yeah. So you're sitting in Europe. We're at a place in time where the pandemic, let's just say all of the events of the 2020s have dramatically changed our world, ways of working, et cetera. But what I also see really striking right now is a certain amount of deglobalization. The regions, whether it be, and I'm going to just broadly group Asia, Americas, Europe, has different priorities and drivers, different stressors, like, the economic conditions in each of these regions is varying tremendously. How do you see this playing out, and how does this play out in your world when you're thinking about executive search? Are your levels of activity different in different regions? Are the different regions looking for different things, whether it be skill set or other things?
Yeah, no. Okay, good question. I think ultimately, everyone wants the same thing. Yeah, everyone wants a candidate who is the best at the job, who will stay forever, and will never want a pay rise. Yeah, so that's what everyone wants. Obviously, that doesn't happen. But I think in different regions, there's no question. Different regions, I think culturally, people look for slightly different things. I think that's really what you're getting at here. So we find in the US, the US is very, very, and it's true, I think also of India is a little bit like this, China is a bit like this, Japan is like this, is very, very much, governed by experience, your experience and your education. Where have you been to school? How good is that qualification, etc.? Is that experience relevant? That is very much still, I think, front and center what people look for. The other side of things, the soft side of things I mentioned earlier, I think are probably less critical, or they're often not looked at a great deal. Certainly US hires. I mean, US hires It's very hard to ask certain questions, and you can't ask anything personal, of course, can you? That makes it quite hard sometimes to really get beneath the surface of what makes people tick. That makes it harder. So I think after COVID, I think things have changed in terms of culturally what people look for. That's still the same, but there have been some changes in terms of how people behave. Yeah. So I would say those countries probably a more based experience. In other places like Europe, the Nordics, places like that, it's very, very much a technically driven hire. Yeah. Technical experience and prowess in the area you're in, whatever field that is really the preeminent thing, I think. Almost eclipses overall experience, or certainly eclipses sort of personality and things like that. And then I think the interesting one, the slightly harder one to do, would be places like Southern Europe, Middle East, maybe. And this very, very relationship driven. And making a hire isn't so much, it's really, I hate to use the expression, who do you know? I mean, that's certainly part of it, of course, but it's the networking ability, the soft side, the likability of people. Do they fit the team? Those things are really very important. And that's more a cultural stereotype in some ways, but it does seem to feed its way through into executive search too. So what we look for is on the surface all the same, but I think once you get into the detail, what you're focusing on is slightly different depending upon where in the world you're hiring. I'm not sure. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And actually, it leads me in. It's a good segue into my next question, which is, you allude to Southern Europe and Middle East being very relationship driven. And this whole aspect of how do you find candidates, right? So it seems that LinkedIn and other social media would like to be the place, right? I mean, it's very easy to find. Yeah. It seems on the surface like it's very easy to find people on those platforms. Right. And yet, does it? How do you guys tackle this? How do you find the right people at the right time in the right place?
Okay, so we don't just rely on LinkedIn. That's number one. I think that's a very important point. I mean, LinkedIn, let's face it, no disrespect to LinkedIn, it's a wonderful tool, very useful. But I equate it in some ways, it's a little bit like wandering into a library and thinking, I want to buy a book on a certain subject. Where do I start? Without having a sort of clear idea what you're looking for, it can be really quite overpowering. And you can waste an awful lot of time looking at things without necessarily finding what you're looking for. And I think the other thing on things like LinkedIn, and it's true of all social media where individuals put their own profiles online, is that how believable are they? I mean, people tend to exaggerate, unfortunately, and they're not always current. So we always have a sort of fairly healthy dose of cynicism, I suppose, when we look at people's profiles on LinkedIn. First of all, are they still doing that? People often. Everything looks rosy, as you say, but people often aren't doing that, or they have other drivers or things they can't publicize. So yes, it's undeniably a useful tool. Things like LinkedIn, there are other ones too, as you know. But yeah, so we use it, I suppose, to, like anyone does, to identify certain individuals, to figure out who does what at certain companies, but certainly do not rely upon it exclusively. We can't. And unfortunately, what's happened in the world of executive search and talent is there's almost been a plethora of new startups and companies doing what we do, who almost exclusively use that because again, it's an open book of names, makes it easy. So what we would say is how we find people. I think we have like five ways we find them. Good old fashioned executive search, i.e., calling companies, researching companies, figuring out who does what. We do a lot of that. Obviously some of that can be cross-referenced on things like LinkedIn, but a lot of that card hold research is important. We do that. We also have, I think, one slight differentiator, which is we have an advisory board that we've set up over the years. I mentioned there's about 15 of us on the sharp end. But very early on doing this job, I realized that we can't possibly have knowledge of every aspect of the chemical industry. There is such a multifaceted, fragmented industry. So we set about developing this advisory board. We have 72 of them, I think, which is quite good. And they cover a whole range of different parts of the industry. And so we go to them. So look, who do you know in this network who's good? They, of course, know where to go. That's useful. I think our website is not bad, dare I say. I think if you put it into Google, chemical executive search. I think we're number one and two in lots of geographies. Yeah, we did something right years ago when we first set the site up. I'm not sure how, but there you go. I'm not going to mess with it.
Yeah.
So we have that way of doing it. And obviously, we have our own little mini network as well, which we set up, a little sort of STEM LinkedIn that we set up. We use, it's got about 30,000 people or so on it. So we use that. Obviously, we use LinkedIn and other networking media to find people. And, last but not least, I mean, our database has been around for, 23 years. It's constantly replenished. And there's a lot of people on there that we are still in touch with many, many years later. So we have sort of five, I suppose, pillars we use to find people. One of which is LinkedIn.
Got it.
So there you go.
That's really cool. Are there particular industries or areas within the chemical industry that are most active right now when you look at talent development and talent movement?
Yeah, yes, there are. I would say, I mean, overall within the world of chemicals and talent, I mean, last year, post-COVID year was a big year. It was a big bounce, and I think pretty much across the board, lots of companies were hiring, including strategically. So there were lots and lots of activity, which lasted, I would say, late 21 up until about sort of the end of 2022. This year now is definitely quieter, I would say, across the board, and of course that is due to the macro picture, potential recession, the war in Ukraine, etc., all those things. So that's definitely slowed things down. But I think in terms of are there bright spots? Yeah, the answer is yes, there are. I mean, I think kind of anything connected with circularity, sustainability, e-mobility, the environmental, anything like that is definitely bright. So, for example, I mean, in the distant past, hydrogen was just an element. So was lithium. Yeah. So were rare earth metals. Although that was the first job we ever did, actually, many years ago. It was in rare earth metals. But of course, all those things now are very much front and center of the world economy. So yes, anything connected with e-mobility, environmental, circularity, they are very, very hot. What's good for us, actually, is that a lot of the companies involved with these areas are often startups or early stage ventures, technology-driven ventures in carbon capture or lithium extraction or things like this. So they are interesting. And the reason we like those companies, of course, is that they don't tend to have enormous talent acquisition teams. It means we get to do the whole thing and act as a true partner. So I think anything in those areas across the board are definitely in vogue. We've worked for a number of them in those various technologies over the last sort of couple of years.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think again, getting back to maybe a regional perspective, I know that certainly from a North American perspective, there's this whole conversation of the war on talent and just the availability of talent. How does that play out in Europe and Asia? Because also I've seen recently, and I know China's been in the news a lot recently, just with their economy not recovering very well post-COVID,
Right.
with new hires lying or new graduates lying down on the street because they are not able to find jobs and stuff, which I know that's not the candidate pool you're targeting, but
Right.
how does this play out geographically in terms of talent, demand, and availability?
Yeah, I think globally it's a similar kind of picture. I mean, certainly in terms of availability. Yeah? So there is this perception. In fact, clients often have this perception that the world is awash with candidates just dying to get a job at their company. That isn't the case. I mean, the US has very high employment rates. The same in the UK, Europe, most of Europe too. I think China is probably a slightly different situation due to its own issues right now. But I think there's two things. Number one, there isn't that much sort of flex in the system. Many people are employed. The other thing being, of course, that a lot of people don't want to move. And I think what's happened here post-COVID is people's values have changed. It used to be, of course, you join a chemical company, you just stay there and you get progression and you move up through the ranks. It doesn't seem that way as much anymore. People value the work-life balance much more now, I think, than they did before COVID. Yeah, that's definitely one thing. So whether it be work-life balance or whether it be location, people want to work remotely. They like this kind of thing as well. Those things play a lot more than they did before. And what that means is, even though finding people who are out there looking for jobs is got harder because there are less of them, and actually moving people from one company to another who are actually happily employed has also got harder, unless you obviously are prepared to offer a big incentive financially or something else. So it's definitely played out. I think globally, this is what's happened, and it's definitely a sort of a repercussion of COVID. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, in the US, we did a search during COVID for a sort of super duper salesperson in the States. And I think the average salary then in the chemical sector was sort of, for a good salesperson, 100, 120, maybe a tiny little 130, as a base salary. The same people, the same jobs now are costing you 140, 160, 175 for the same thing. So there's a definite inflation of expectation of salaries, which is partly due, of course, to inflation, but it's also just due to scarcity of supply of candidates, and that's feeding its way through. So that's the case in the States. I think in Europe, it's a very, very similar story, to be frank with you. I can't really give you an idea. With a lot of Asia, it's sort of similar to a point. I think China's different, because China definitely has this a problem with the actual companies themselves and not supplying, and therefore there's a glut of candidates. That's different. But I think after COVID, these are macro trends are affecting everybody in a similar kind of way, I would say, across the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. What strikes me about it is it's almost a from a work-life balance, location value perspective, it's almost like it's back to the 1950s, right? Where there was the home-based values were much stronger, and that drove people's decisions about where to live, where to work, et cetera. So it's obviously vastly different time that we're in now, and yet maybe in certain aspects of our lives, our values have reverted a bit, right? So we're just kind of in continual evolution.
Yeah, it may not be a bad thing. I think providing profitability is there and productivity is there. Is it a bad thing? Most people don't think so. So
yeah,
awesome.
There you go. So what's your number one piece of advice to candidates that are looking to get hired, hoping to get hired, making a move, hopefully for more money, because we all like more money when we make a move? What falls into your top pieces of advice for people?
Interesting. Don't do it for the money. I think that's the number one advice I would give. Do it for the fact you like the company and you like the role, and the money I think will catch up with you. You'll get what you need. I mean, what I would say to I suppose, in the earlier stage people who've asked me the same kind of question, what's the best way to get progression? And I would say the same thing, which is don't have outside interests. Do not focus your whole life on that job. And I tend to find in what we do, some of the most successful people we know, are they're captain of the local rugby club, or they are football scholars, or they do various things, or they're involved with their school's governorship program, whatever it may be. But having sort of very strong external values and external activities seems to feed through and make you somehow more valuable. And you're not sort of dwelling only on the money. So I think that's one thing I would definitely say.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. Final question. What's your outlook on hiring for the rest of 23 and then heading into 24?
I would say, I think 23 it has been quite flat. Yeah. I mean, I think until things sort themselves out with the war in Ukraine, I mean that's a definite suppressor of economic activity. Do we know where we are with that? And the threat of the looming recession dwindles. I think it'll still fairly flat. Yeah, when we know where we are with that, it will pick up again. As I said to you, I mean, some of these areas are still fairly robust, but I think the heavy end of the chemical industry is still, and it's so dependent upon energy prices, etc., which is the problem. The middle bit, of course, is based upon consumer demand for pool chemicals and cars and polyurethanes and things like that. And all the time that there's flattened consumer demand, they'll be flattened. So I think the bright spark to the bright part still is probably, as I said to you before, fine chemicals, pharma, agri-chemicals, things like that. They're feeding into things that people still need. So they are still fine. But I think the other part of the industry, as I said, the heavy end and the specialty end won't pick up, I don't think, this year probably some point in 24. I've got a feeling it'll pick up back up again once we're hopefully past the threat of recession.
Perfect. Sounds great. All right. Well, we'll stay tuned and we'll see where that plays out. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today on the Chemical Show. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Great pleasure, Victoria. Thank you. Thanks.
And thanks everyone for joining us today. Keep listening, keep following, keep sharing, and we will talk to you again soon.
We've come to the end of today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed your time with us and want to learn more. Simply visit thechemicalshow.com for additional information and helpful resources. Join us again next time here on The Chemical Show with Victoria Meyer.